Hello and welcome to a video on looking at Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. Now before we look at it, we're going to look at the concept of kamikaze and what a kamikaze soldier is. Now they relate to Japanese soldiers. Now they're originally called the Special Attack Units, and they flew planes into the enemies with the idea of killing themselves and a lot of their enemy. And often the planes that they used would be one journey only planes. And this is during World War II, because one of the reasons that Japan was at war with the Allies was because of their aggressive nature at that time and taking over and wanting to invade China. And so the Allies, similar to Germany, wanted to prevent this aggressive stance and warlike stance, so they fought them. The kamikaze soldiers were a suicide mission. These men knew that they were going to die, so they got into the plane with the key objective of killing as many people as possible. But the phrase kamikaze came later on, because obviously they were called Special Attack Units, but the phrase kamikaze came later on in association with these Special Attack Units. Because it came from, historically, this concept called the divine wind. And basically it links to Japanese history, where there was a massive battle against the Mongols, and basically a storm wiped out a whole fleet of the Japanese enemy. And, and it was basically this idea that some power, some divine god had created this act. And so the idea is that these soldiers are like an act of God. They're destroying the enemy, and hence why the newspapers, the Japanese newspapers, coined these soldiers as kamikaze soldiers. And as I've mentioned there before. Now before starting any poem, you need to think of ideas. And so what we're going to do, before we read the poem, I'm going to go through some possible ideas. Now these questions are all linked to the poem Kamikaze. And before we read it, I want you to think about these ideas yourself. What influences your thoughts, feelings and actions? So what are the influences behind everything that you do? The other question I want you to think about is what is your duty in life? Who do you serve? And that word duty, it's kind of like what you're obliged to do. What do you feel is necessary? Do you do it for yourself? Do you do it for your family? Or do you do it for your country? And the final question is, why do people fight and risk their life in war? Now we're going to use this pause symbol just to show you a point where you can pause the video, just have a little bit of a think about that before we actually look at the poem. Because I think it's really important when you're looking at poetry that you remember that poems are about ideas. They're not just a bag of techniques. So you really need to think about the ideas first before you start looking at the poem. So just pause the video now, and when you see the symbol disappear, that's the time to move on. Okay, just going to read through the poem to you. Okay, you will be able to get a copy of the poem when you come back to school, but also we'll send an electronic copy of the poem to yourself. So, Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword, in the cockpit, a shaven head, full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down, at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting, on a green-blue translucent sea. And beneath them, arcing in swathes, like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun. And remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles, to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bring in their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat, safe. To the shore, salt-sodden, awash, with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed. Till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Now let's go back to the poem and think about these questions. What influences our thoughts and feelings and actions? What is our duty in life? Who do we serve? Ourselves, family, country? And why do people fight and risk their life in war? Now this poem, very simple poem, but it's confusing because who's telling the story? We've got a daughter who's talking about her father who was originally going to be a suicide kamikaze soldier. He decides to change his mind and he doesn't commit suicide and kill some of the enemy. And he comes home and the family ignore him and the family don't even raise their eyes to him, and that includes the children. Now this is the daughter telling this story to her own children, and that'll come in a bit and you'll see how important it is. But it raises these questions, these ideas. What influences our thoughts and feelings and actions? So here we've got a kamikaze soldier who is willing to actually die at the start of the poem for his country. And the interesting thing about the kamikaze soldiers, because people kind of think it was kind of like for patriotism, and that was the reason why they did it. And actually there's a number of different reasons. It's not always clear cut. Now a lot of people were coerced into doing it and they were pressured. There was a lot of peer pressure. We know that in World War I with a lot of young soldiers. But also there was an idea of protecting families. That it wasn't about patriotism, but it was about protecting families. And what a lot of young soldiers were worried about was the fact that an enemy could wipe out your whole family completely. And so by them sacrificing their lives, they were ensuring that their family lived on. And so it's a lot more complex than just saying that this is a poem that's about being patriotic. It's also about that kind of why people change their minds and when they've committed they're going to do something and what's going on there. So what influences our thoughts and feelings and actions? Well, the poem's quite interesting because we look at this poem and we can see that there's lots of influences, because at the start of the poem it's talking about incantations, that there's elements of religion in there that influences him at the start. And there's lots of theories that the kamikaze soldiers were brainwashed into fighting, and hence why we keep getting references to flag in the poem, because the idea that people follow the flag and they do it for their country. But there's other things, because actually what we've got in the poem is the fact that the daughter learns to ignore the father. And so what we get is with this idea that, yes, the father didn't kill himself, but actually not killing himself is seen as being something far worse and somehow losing honour and being shameful. And so, but that isn't something that a child thinks automatically from themselves. So what we see in the poem is actually the parents, the mother's attitude towards the father has influenced the child. And so we see that kind of idea there of how you know, adults and parents change our way of thinking and feeling, because as a child, originally, they didn't think anything was wrong that the father came back and hadn't killed himself. But actually, it's the adults around them that change them. And that idea of culture. Also this idea about duty. What's our duty in life? Who do we serve, ourselves or family? And so here we've got a person who doesn't do his duty to his country and doesn't do his duty for his family, and in fact thinks about his own needs above everything else. And you can kind of say, well, that's normal, that's kind of how we think, but culturally that's quite different to how others in different cultures view things. You know, that importance of honour of the family, honouring the family and supporting the family. Here we've got somebody that chooses themselves over their family. And then the last question, we've got this idea about why do people fight and risk their life in wars? And here we've got Garland giving us a poem about that exact question. That's what this poem is about. Why? Because what we've got in the poem is simply a soldier choosing not to risk their life. We've seen it in one of the other poems, soldiers dying brave, noble, the honour, the dignity that they get. And yet here we've got a poem where actually this isn't a soldier that dies. He makes a choice not to die. And actually the sad thing is that he has kind of a metaphorical death, doesn't he? It seems like death, that nobody sees him at the end. Now, I've got the pause symbol there because I've got some words there at the bottom. Patriotism, duty, allegiance, faith, blind faith, honour and debt. Now what I'd like to do for me is just pause the video and just think, right, what is this poem saying about these ideas? So what is it saying about patriotism? What is it saying about duty, allegiance, faith, blind faith, okay, faith in something you can't quite see, honour and debt? So just pause the video and just have a bit of a think about what you could say with those and what the poem is saying about with those ideas themselves. Now the reason why I put those words at the bottom there is because we could, and you could, in the exam have a poem and a question that asks you about faith, or it could ask you about patriotism or honour. And so we need to have those ideas. And when we're talking about the poem, we should be using these words and using those words to kind of explain what the poet is saying. Now before we look at the poem in a little bit of detail, I'm just going to go through some very, very interesting things with the poem itself to give you a bit of a context about these kind of soldiers. Now, lots of people, lots of men volunteered to become kamikaze soldiers. And one captain named them as being like bees, and he said that the kamikaze soldiers are a bit like bees because they die after they have stung. So they've got a very, very powerful sting, but after that they die. And that's kind of the idea that we've got here. Now, the opening of the poem starts with part of that ceremony and that kind of culture. And there was a very clear process that soldiers went through. And they had a drink, okay, from a ceremonial cup. They had their sword with them. They had a belt of 1,000 stitches. Now that would be usually given by a family member, and they would wear this belt, and the belt itself was a good luck charm, and so they would have that, so they would succeed. They'd also have letters and poems that they'd write to their loved ones, and they'd have prayers from their family that they'd carry with them. So there was quite a lot about them. And so these soldiers didn't just go into battle straight away. they did actually take their time and got into this kind of state of mind where they're ready to go. And if we have a look, their mind full of powerful incantations, that shaven head, the idea of being clean, and this idea of ready, ready to die, shaven head, taking away their identity, but also water, that sense of purity. Now what's interesting is when you look at the poems, and you look at this poem in particular, that actually these kamikaze soldiers were young men. And here is an example of a letter that was written by one particular man. Thank you for the greatness. Up to my 27 years of age, I will fall with a cherry blossom, April 6th. And when you look at that, it's not very emotional, and it's not somebody that's very, very upset, but it sounds like somebody that's very, very clear and set in what they're going to do. And we tend to think this idea of somebody fighting and willing to kill themselves are going to be very emotional, very powerful. Actually, if you look at this, it's quite measured. And when we look at the opening, that's what we've got. It's very emotionless in the poem. Now, an interesting thing about the kamikaze soldiers is a lot of kamikaze soldiers wrote poems before they died. And these are two particular poems that are written. Now they've been translated, and often they tended to be haikus or a very rigid structure of poem. But they were written and they were given to their family, to their wives, to their mothers, to their fathers, and to their brothers and sisters. And so it gives you a sense of idea of what their mind is like at that point. So the first one, having ambition for the skies, what to do with waves surging towards Japan. Young cherry blossoms now leave to overcome, long-awaited departure has arrived. Smiling, young cherry blossoms to fall. We have a look at the other poem. Cherry blossom to fall bravely, bloom beautifully, cherry blossoms that can stay. Now I go as a shield for the emperor, a Yamato warrior to shatter as a jewel. Now these two poems are quite standard, and in Japanese culture a death poem is quite a set form of poetry that often people do write, particularly at this time, and it's a reflection of death and preparing themselves, and it's quite a moving and quite a meaningful observation of life. Now you can see here in these two poems that we've got a clear imagery. We're seeing the cherry blossom. Now cherry blossom is, and you can see it on the left hand picture, is a beautiful plant, and you can see that it's very beautiful, it's very delicate, very decorative, and how this idea, it's how the soldiers are like cherry blossoms. Alright, or it's like life, and this idea that we know it's going to die and people are going to die, however, it's beautiful, life is beautiful, and that's what we've got in this sense of the poem, that they are beautiful, but obviously that understanding that they've got to die, or they've got to protect people so other people can live and be beautiful. We've also got the other idea about the shield, and how we've got a soldier, who is actually there to protect. We've got two very, very positive images. Now these images come again and again in a lot of the writing from kamikaze soldiers. So this idea of nature and beauty, and this idea of being a shield. So we've got very, very positive images associated with what they're going to do. Commit suicide. Now we're going to start looking at the poem, and we're going to start looking at some interesting things that we can talk about this, because those small poems are called death poems, and they're a form of poem. Now I would argue that actually what we have got here is in a way a kind of death poem, and we've got lots of the things that we associate with Japanese death poetry that we've got in this poem, but there is a twist, because this man didn't die. And so what we have got is we've kind of got a sense of irony, but it's a death poem, but it's a kind of different type of death poem. It's a kind of a metaphorical death rather than an actual physical death that we've got here. And so I'd say that Garland actually uses elements and bits of that death poem. So for example, we've got this idea that it's a reflection of death and a meaningful understanding of life. Well, that's what we've got in this poem, because we've got this soldier in his plane looking down, and he understands. He's looking at life and looking at how beautiful life is. It's a typically graceful poem. It's about beauty and about the world around us. It's about nature. It's emotionally neutral as a poem, in that it's not, clearly aggressive or sad. It's kind of like somewhere in the middle in terms of the emotions. Death isn't mentioned explicitly, so it doesn't describe the act of dying, but it mentions it subtly, doesn't it? And then we've got metaphorical references to death. So we've got life, we've got the fishes being collected, and obviously they're being killed, but also we've got this idea of people not talking to him. And so we've got this idea of metaphors being used to show death. Now, taking the poem further, we're now going to carry on with that thread. So we've got our ideas about the poem, and now we're going to have a look at the language things. Now, remember what we said about poetry, and we said that poems are ideas first. Now, a lot of the problems that students make with poetry is they go straight into the techniques, and they can spot a technique really, really easy. That's the problem with poetry, because it's the ideas and linking them to the language that gets you the marks. It's not what you can spot. So this is where you have to be really, really careful when looking at poem, because if you just spot techniques without the explanation, you really, really struggle. The problem we have with a lot of students is they start with a technique and then they try and link it into the ideas in the poem. Always start with the ideas first and then link into the techniques. So that's where we come into our how does the writer present it, what does the writer use, and what is the writer teaching us. So if we look, I've picked out 4 things. Now remember, in the poem, you do not need to be mentioning hundreds of things. You need to have some good things, and those good things you've got to be able to link to ideas. So if we have a look at the first one on the left, at the little fishing boat strung out like bunting. Now bunting, we know about that, it's that kind of those flags, little flags that we put out to celebrate, and that partying. So this kamikaze soldier, he's in his plane, ready to kill himself, and he's looking down over the landscape where he lives, and he's seeing these boats. And when you look at fishing boats, they have fishing lines between them drawn out, so the boats are like the flags, and then the fishing line in the water is actually the rope that connects all the flags together. Now this image, well, it creates this a positive image. It's kind of a happy image, and so it could be that sense of he's looking down and he's seeing, and we get that sense of excitement about this pride that he's got for the landscape that he's got there. But the other thing as well is a flag, and a flag links into that idea of patriotism, and this idea that is he thinking about his country, and so all he can see is a flag, and he's thinking about his country. And what do flags do? They represent a country and that identity. So is he thinking? Now some people think that the fact that he keeps mentioning here in this simile, and later on underneath the other simile, like a huge flag, is this idea that he's brainwashed, that he's looking at the natural world, but actually he can't escape from this brainwashing. And so this idea that this allegiance to your country, and so we said about that kind of that debt, that allegiance is there, but it's kind of brainwashing and linked to it the flag. And this idea that the second simile that we've got, like a huge flag waved first one way and then the other in a figure of eight. Now a figure of eight, obviously, if you turn it on its side, is also the infinity sign. So this idea that this patriotism seems that you've always got to be patriotic. You can't not be patriotic to your country. So it's this idea that you cannot escape this. So is this an idea that we've got in the poem, that this man cannot escape these patriotic feelings, and this idea that actually he has been brainwashed and that he is trapped, and that sense of an infinity, that sense of escape. One of the things people said about the poem is the structure of the poem. It's very, very rigid in terms of it's got lots of 6-line stanzas, which is quite a tight structure for a poem, which could reflect the Japanese culture here of being very, very rigid in this way that honour is treated with these kamikaze soldiers in the past. We've then got another thing here. So we've got the turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe. Now remember, this goes back to this idea of the divine wind, and waves is a key image that's used in a lot of Japanese imagery, associating with obviously power and divine power. So here we've got the father's boat, okay, and we've got this idea of the father's boat, which is very similar to the soldier, the soldier that is in the plane. You know, boat and plane, both modes of transport. So here we've got this idea that, you know, the dad is similar to his dad, and there's kind of a connection there. And whereas, you know, the grandfather is actually, you know, using a boat, the father is using a plane, and actually we're getting a connection, and so he's making a connection. All this is imagined in the daughter's mind. Remember when I said that it's quite confusing from a poem, because you've got lots of different people in this poem that you've got to think about. So he's making connection. So the boat here is a symbol, and so the writer uses that boat. And so this idea that, you know, a boat is there to collect fish, and obviously it's there to, you know, to survive and for him to live. And so what we're seeing with the boat is actually that connection between the father and the grandfather. And so the boat is a symbol. And so the poet is using that to show us how actually the soldier looking down his plane, thinking about the boat, is taken to a past. He's taken to a nostalgic time where he's thinking about what his father used to do and the dangers he faced. So the waves. So his father actually dealt with dangers like he's dealing with, but the father returned home safe, whereas he almost didn't, if he didn't change his mind there. And then we've got the last bit here. Black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of white bait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular and dangerous. Now, we've got lots of repetition of colour, and we've got that idea of colours. So we know that colours are attractive and they're interesting, and so what we've got in the poem is we've kind of got a contrast, because we've got this dull grey world, which is the one that the kamikaze soldier is driving into, because he's got water, plain, and then he's shaved his hair. It's, you know, very, very, you know, colourless world that we've got there. And he's looking down and he's seeing all this different colour. We've got the translucent blues, we've got this, and we're seeing the vividness of life and nature. And in a way, what the poet here is doing is he's showing us how brilliant nature is and how beautiful the world is. And what we're seeing is we're seeing something change in the poem. We're seeing a change. Now, going back to those poets those death poems, one of the things that those kamikaze soldiers did is they turned a death into something beautiful. So they saw the idea of their death being like cherry blossoms, something beautiful. So they did that, and that gave that kind of that calmness around that what they were doing, it was a sense of beauty about it. They were doing something good, and it was beautiful because it was good. Here in the poem, we're seeing a change in that beauty. The beauty is moving away from death, and it's focusing on life, and nature is that source of beauty. Now, I'm going to get you to pause the video and just have a bit of a think now, and think of, is there anything else in the poem that helps us explain some of those ideas about patriotism, duty, allegiance, faith, blind faith, honour, debt? Now remember, it could be a word, it could be a technique, it could be a phrase. Just have a bit of a think and just pause the video and think, what else could you use to talk about these ideas in the poem? Okay, now we're going to have a look at the structure of the poem. Now, one of the things that students are very good at is spotting techniques, but form and structure are not the best thing that students talk about. And so when you're thinking about structure, it's like paper 1 question 3, you're thinking about what is the focus at the start, what's the focus in the middle, and what's the focus at the end. Now, what's interesting about this poem is that the fact that it starts and ends in quite dull, matter-of-fact way. And what we see in the middle of the poem is actually a vision of beauty and a great experience. But surrounding that is this kind of sad, matter-of-fact. Now, if we have a look at the opening, you can see it's kind of very focused. It's purely functional. This is what I've got to do. It's all about the ceremony and the process of what a kamikaze soldier would do. If we look at the end of the poem, till gradually we too learn to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Now, interestingly, there's very few emotions in that there. And the fact that we've got keyword silent, we can imagine, apart from anything else, that the opening's silent. So we have that sense of silence, but also visual silence. And always interesting to look at how this poem ends on the word die, and it begins with the father. Her father embarked at sunrise, which had been the better way to die. So it starts with the father about to plan his death, and then it ends with this dilemma, wondering, should he have died, should he have made that decision or not. And so what we have in the poem is we kind of have a bit of a journey. We have this journey that we've got, and the poem is about a number of journeys, because we've not just got the father's journey. So his journey originally was going to be to kill himself, but he changes his mind. So that was one journey. His other journey would have been this emotional journey. So the journey of going, I'm going to kill myself, I'm not going to, I'm going to stay with my family, but then they don't love me in the way that they used to love me. And so there we have that emotional journey. Then we also have the daughter's journey, because she's the one that's telling the poem to us. So she starts off by telling us her father embarked, and sometimes she said he must have wondered. So she's going through an emotional journey, and her emotional journey is that she used to love her father, but because of the culture she stopped loving him. And then right at the end, and in the way this is what this poem is doing, is her kind of coming to a point where actually she's realising the mistakes that she's made, and maybe she should have shown that she loved her father a bit more. So you can see how this poem is about a journey and how we're going from one point to another, but also how this poem in the middle is quite visual and full of imagery, but actually at the heart of the poem is we've got this idea: why do soldiers commit suicide in this situation? And we can see why. And the reason is why is because you can't function in life. You don't have a proper life unless you do this sort of thing, certainly in this Japanese structure in the 1940s. Now that we've gone through our ideas and some of the techniques, now we can start pulling things together and start thinking. Now this is where students do fall down, because what they don't do is they talk about the ideas and they talk about the techniques, but what they don't do is they don't say what it teaches us. So remember these words from one of the other videos. So if you haven't found the video for teachers with poetry, then have a look in it, because it goes through this in a lot more detail than this, and it'll help explain things. So we're going to look at this. So what does it teach us? So we're going to think about, this is that step up now. Now a lot of people, what they tend to do is they have an idea, they spot something, and then what they do is they just reword what the quote says, or they put it in their own words. And what we need is we need that step up. And the step up is, what is it teaching us? Why has Garland done this? So what is it? What is her reasoning for doing this? Now remember, we don't know without having the poet in the room with us, so we're putting ideas into their mouths. So it could be the idea, how patriotism. Maybe what Garland is doing is she's criticising patriotism and how actually people go into it blind and not aware. And so, for example, this soldier here, he didn't realise what the consequences were of going against it, and that's not an easy decision, and how actually people are forced into acts of patriotism and these suicidal acts because of the consequences are far worse than dying. We also see in the poem that how the individual is crushed by society. Here is a man who makes a choice, but society doesn't like it, and society, through his wife and his children and his family, who represent the wider world, ignore him. So you have to follow what everybody else is doing, otherwise you're shunned. And so we've got this battle about the individual. So he couldn't make a choice, really. He had to do what society told him to do. If he didn't, we see the consequences. We also see the issue about traditions and how actually traditions can be both positive and negative things. And here we see the tradition of Kamikaze soldiers and the respect, and how that tradition of how good it is could be for a family and how honourable it is, but actually it's not such a good thing. And actually, it has an emotional consequence that's not just about the man, but also the family as well. Here's another interesting idea, that maybe Garland teaches us how children learn from their parents. The daughter originally didn't shun her father. Only after time did she do that. And another interesting thing that maybe Garland is teaching us is how our culture shapes and defines its people. So how does the world you live in and the country that you live in and the people around you, how do they control the way that you think and feel? Now, we talked about that idea of brainwashing, but we've also got the idea here is it's not just about the soldier being brainwashed, but also we've got families being brainwashed. Now, most of us, when reading the poem, you think, well, we wouldn't do that to our own family. We'd kind of understand what they were going through and understand the difficult choices they were making. But here we've got two levels of brainwashing. We've got the brainwashing behind the soldier, but also we've got the brainwashing around the families around these patriotic kamikaze soldiers. Now, remember, developing your ideas. Where else do we see this in the poem? So where else do we see this idea of blindness? Where do we see that of faith? Or the idea of the individual being crushed by society? And quite interesting, if we have a look at the tuna and how we've got fishing boats and we've got fish. And it's interesting that fish are used in this poem and people catching fish. And this idea of fish, you know, swim around in shoals, don't they, in large groups. And if you watch fish and how they move, is they tend to kind of all swim in the same direction when they're in a shoal. So this idea of the fish could be a metaphor for how people are in society and how it takes one fish, the tuna, possibly. And notice how the poet draws attention to the tuna. That is something that stands against the rest of society. Well, let's think about why would Garland have this anti-patriotic, anti-suicide soldiers stance? What could be the reasoning? Well, could be because she's a modern poet and she's living in the modern age, and we hear about news about suicide bombers and that idea, and she's trying to understand, possibly from her perspective, a modern perspective, what would make people do that, but also what would change their understanding and what would change them from doing that. You know, and I think it's a lot more nuanced poem than we kind of like to think. What is the poet aiming to do? Yes, they might teach us this, but what is the poet hoping for us to do? Now, generally might think that what she's trying to make us do is understand the thought processes that goes through a kamikaze soldier, and understand, maybe if we can understand what would stop and change these people, we could actually understand the issue in more depth. And also, what's going on at the time? You know, Garland is writing from a modern perspective. She's alive, writing poetry at the moment, so maybe she's inspired by something that's happened in the news. You know, she would have experienced, not actually been there, but she would have seen on television about Afghanistan and Iraq, so maybe she's seen suicide bombers and this idea of, you know, and maybe that's been the inspiration, thinking, why would people do that? And so she's kind of thinking from that angle. All this is that development that you need to have to get to that kind of top level. And remember, it's not the things that you spot, it's the explanation. And by focusing on what the poet is teaching us, you're developing that explanation. So if you can say that the poet Garland teaches us and attacks patriotism because we see it in the flags and the repetition of the flags, the poet is questioning the stance that people have nowadays of being so happy to fight and to go to war for things, and she's questioning that. Now the poems and the assessment is going to be about making connections between the poems. Now at this point you may have read a few poems or one or two poems, so here are just some connections that you can think about. Okay, the power of nature. This poem is about how nature makes a man wake up and shows him the reality of what he's doing. He sees nature in a different light, and it's about the power of nature. We see that in the prelude, we see that in Ozymandias. This poem is also about the power of emotions, but also the lack of emotions. The start and the end of the poem is this about an emotionless experience. We've got the power of honour, and we see that honour in charge of the Light Brigade, and we see how brave and noble. And in a way, this poem could be an alternative to Charge the Light Brigade, because we see the soldiers that die, but what about the soldiers that walked away? What about the soldier that took the decision to not follow those instructions? Which would be a dishonourable thing, but we see that, and we see the impact of not following instructions. The poem is also about the conflict between the individual and society. Society says you must do this. The individual disagrees. And what happens in this poem is the individual isn't happy. And we see that in other poems like Remains. Bayonet Charge is about that, about having individual thoughts. If you look at Charge the Light Brigade, that's all about society. Society tells you that you should fight and should die for your country. That's a great thing to do. That's what the poem is saying. But poems like Bayonet Charge, Remains, and Kamikaze question that. Is it honourable? Is it noble to die for one's country? And, is that just a lie that society is teaching us? The other thing we've got is that duty, that conflict between the duty of your duty and family. Who is your duty to? Is it to your country or to your family? And then we've got here the conflict between thoughts and feelings, that there is a battle between what you feel and what you think. Again, linking into Charge Light Brigade, because we've got the soldiers who are probably feeling scared and worried, and their thoughts that they could be dying, and that battle between those two things. And here we've got the battle between those two things here. We've got this idea, the feelings of, thinking about my family, but also the thoughts of what would happen. And we have that battle between those two different elements there. Okay. Last little activity then for you. So we've got some key questions in the poem. Okay, I just want to pause the video and just see if you can remember the answers to these. As soon as the signs disappeared, that's when we're going to go through the answers. Okay, so the answer to number 1 is divine wind. Number 2, what did he notice when he looked down? Well, it's the boats and the fishing boats and the nets. Whose boat does he think about? His father or the woman's grandfather. What D is the last word in the poem? And that's die. 5, what T is described as a dark prince? Tuna. 6, what E wouldn't meet afterwards? 7, what technique does the writer use to show us all the things he's leaving behind? Well, you've got 2 choices there. You can either say lists or you can say colours. 8, what simile does the writer use to show us how good life used to be for him? Now, it could be the bunting or the flag. And we've got what piece of alliteration is used to suggest the peace and calm. So we've got lots of sibilants in there and lots of sh sounds, the sh sounds in there in the poem. feel free to watch the video again and pause it, make notes as you go along. Obviously we haven't gone through everything in the poem, and we're not going to go through line by line, but we've just gone through some of the ideas, some of the techniques, and some of the messages that you could say about this poem. Now remember, in the exam you do not need to know absolutely everything about the poem. You need to know the poem well and be able to mention a few things about how it's written, and a few ideas about it, and a few things that it's trying to teach us. Now, the key thing with the poems is read and read and read. Read them again, highlight anything you find interesting and note, but remember, it's not about spotting all the techniques. You need to be talking about the ideas. The ideas, and how does the writer show those ideas? That's your techniques in your language, in your form, and your structure. And then think about what does it teach us? So those are the three things. So remember, how does it present it? Your ideas. What does it use? That's the techniques, language, form and structure. And what does it teach us? If you are talking about those three things, then you are going to write a good response in relation to this poem. Thank you.